Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 309 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. The history of North America is a history of connection. Connection between peoples and cultures, places and regions. And by the 17th century, international connections between different nations and empires through the goods, news, and people sent across the Atlantic Ocean. By the 18th century, the Atlantic Ocean became a busy highway of sorts, full of ships crisscrossing its waters. What do we know about the ships that made these transatlantic voyages and made the world of 18th century international connection possible? Philip Reed, a historian who specializes in maritime history, joins us to explore the 18th century British merchant ship and how its seafaring technology allowed the British Atlantic world to stay connected. Now, during our investigation, Philip reveals details about the 18th century British merchant ship and its technological development, information about shipbuilding and what ship buyers looked for when purchasing a merchant ship, and how and why ship owners undertook the important work of ship maintenance and mitigating the financial risks involved with transatlantic shipping and sailing. But first, I'd like to thank you for being a subscriber to the Ben Franklin's World subscription program. Your financial support helps the Omohundro Institute and I make this podcast, and we couldn't keep it going without your help. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And if you're not yet a subscriber to the Ben Franklin's World subscription program, it's never too late to join. Subscribers receive ad-free versions of each new episode and a monthly bonus episode. You can sign up and learn more about the program at benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. That's benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. Okay, are you ready to tour around a virtual 18th century shipyard and learn more about merchant ship technology? Let's go meet our expert guide. Our guest is an independent scholar and historian. He has a research specialty in the history of the Atlantic world, the history of technology, and in maritime history. Plus, he's published a book on all of these topics. The Merchant Ship in the British Atlantic: Continuity and Innovation in a Key Technology. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Philip Reed.
Thanks, Liz. I'm real happy to be here.
Philip, I wonder if we could begin our conversation with the merchant ship. You write in your book, The Merchant Ship in the British Atlantic, that without the merchant ship, the British Empire would not have been able to establish and maintain dominance in the early modern Atlantic world. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the early modern Atlantic world and about the merchant ship that allowed Great Britain to dominate that world.
Sure. Behind the merchant ship, of course, we have merchants. And we know that a network of merchants in the late 16th and early 17th century England took advantage of support from both Elizabeth I and James I to launch commercial ventures in Europe, in Asia, and in the Americas. England's an island, so some sort of watercraft were necessary to go anywhere but Scotland. Land travel was slow and arduous in most cases and impeded by political borders, some of which were probably hostile at any given time, so these merchants needed vessels that could do more than cross the English Channel. They used them to get to trading destinations that we would associate with land travel across Europe, such as Russia. And of course, they used them to get to the markets of the Far East and westward across the Atlantic to the Americas. So these ships had to be seaworthy to survive potentially horrendous conditions on the open sea. And they had to be capacious enough to carry enough sailors, their food, their water, and commercial cargo to be viable as commercial ventures. They were also armed, so they had to be designed and built in such a way to carry heavy guns, powder, and shot.
Now, what made the 18th century British merchant ship so special? Because if you think about the history of the Dutch Republic, right, in the 17th century, in the Dutch Golden Age, the Dutch were able to establish much of the economic dominance that Britain would later establish during the 18th century because they had these fast ships and vast trade networks that really allowed them to carry trade all around the Mediterranean and Baltic Seas and even into East Asia. So what made the British merchant ships of the 18th century different from these earlier ships?
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up right now, because when we think about what's special about the English merchant ship, the British merchant ship later on, one answer that actually is worth throwing out there is nothing, at least not at first. The English are really following a Dutch lead. They recognize, acknowledge even that the Dutch are the masters of this, as my book opens. It's 1600 in the early 17th century, on into the mid to even later 17th century, sort of the Dutch heyday. And the vast majority of the maritime technology, these ships, even smaller craft, most of them that we can trace Dutch influence or just straight up Dutch provenance. So, as a professor of mine once said in graduate school, when it came to the English policy toward the Dutch in the 17th century, if you can't join them, beat them. It got to the point, of course, where it was so frustrating to the English as they were attempting to compete with the Dutch in this maritime enterprise that they just ended up going to war with them and capturing a whole bunch of their ships. And as a matter of fact, until all of those captured ships, which numbered in the hundreds, wore out, we think it actually retarded English shipbuilding along Dutch lines because they didn't need to do it. They had Dutch vessels. And then when they did run out of those or started to run out of those, then we do start to see Dutch characteristics incorporated into English ships. So the English really were, they were kind of latecomers to this. They were behind the Dutch, but they were also, of course, behind the Spanish and the Portuguese. They were competing with the Dutch, competing with the French, and of course, competing with the Iberians as well. So you can't really say, oh, well, they had these special ships that were better suited for Atlantic maritime enterprise. That's not true at all.
That's really interesting, because I think when many of us think of ships and how we might acquire one, the natural way would be to go to a shipbuilder and have one built for us. But it sounds like on the ground that capturing a ship like the English did in these many Anglo-Dutch wars and just using the ships that they captured was really a much more practical option.
Yes, and they would later do the same with the French. And there's this interesting sort of psychological element to this that I noticed with the French ships later on as we get towards the end of the 18th century. But it certainly also manifested itself in this earlier rivalry with the Netherlands, where you sort of have this paranoid attitude that your adversary can do it better than you, that they've got better stuff than you. And you better figure out, what they're doing right and learn to copy it and do it better, or you're going to get left behind. And I think that did spur the English and later British shipping industries, and certainly the Navy, to pay attention to what their rivals were doing and see how they could benefit from that.
So what did the English see in these Dutch merchant ships, and what improvements and innovations did they make on this Dutch sailing technology and perhaps French sailing technology that was capable of producing the 18th century British merchant ship?
It is still open to debate. We have to use a lot of archaeology for this. And then when you get into causation or causality, what caused these things to be, what were the imperatives behind these technological differences or distinct characteristics? That's still very much open to study. But what we can say is that early on, the Dutch figured out how to build a cargo vessel that was simple, relatively inexpensive, not difficult to build, wasn't the sturdiest thing out there, certainly wasn't the fastest, but it was capacious. And it's generally loosely called the flute. The problem with the flute and the way the Dutch were using their ships was that, unlike the Baltic, which is a pretty safe place to do trade, the Atlantic was always hostile. You had the competing maritime powers. Of course, you had Spain from the get-go trying to maintain that nobody but them had the right to be in the Americas, and they would attack other people's vessels. You had the long 80-year war between the Dutch and the Spanish. You had the English raiding, you had the French, and then you had piracy. So it was a violent place. And what the Dutch figured out was you really just couldn't use unarmed merchant ships like this in the Atlantic trade. You really needed a vessel that combined more characteristics of the warship and the merchant ship, especially in the 17th and early 18th centuries, if you wanted to make this viable. And that especially became true once the English became hostile to the Dutch, they just started taking these ships. And so in a way, I think the Dutch were trying this at the wrong time in the wrong place, and they paid a price for that. But ultimately, some of the characteristics of these vessels would find their way into English ships. Perhaps one of the most important of those is that a Dutch ship tended to be broader and shallower than an English ship. And some of that we think has to do with the shallowness of the entrances to Dutch harbors, but there's some debate about that. We think that maybe there's more to it than that. It does affect the sailing characteristics of the vessel, but it is true that, a shallower, broader vessel can get into skinnier water. That's one of the things that we do see creep into the English ship in the 18th century. And we do think that's a Dutch carryover or adoption. But also rigs, sailing rigs, really all of the rigs that become predominant in the Atlantic, we can trace to an early Dutch version. It's almost across the board general that we can do that. Because, of course, in the 17th century, they were going to Asia. We now think perhaps they were picking up some of their new ideas from shipping that they encountered in Asia, which would have come both from the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, but also from the Muslim world. So all of these influences on them would then trickle down, so to speak, or be captured literally by the English and incorporated.
It's really interesting to hear how European imperial rivalries during the 17th and 18th centuries really filtered down to shipbuilding, of all things, and also how the interconnectedness of the world through trade also impacted shipbuilding and how you'd build a ship. I mean, there's just a lot of different connections here.
Yeah, and one of the things that strikes you is, especially when you think about the whole concept of mercantilism, where the concept is your empire is self-contained and is in competition with other empires. You don't want to share. You don't want cross-pollination. You certainly don't want to bleed or leak resources or advantages to other empires. And yet, ships go everywhere. And not only do ships go everywhere, but shipwrights go everywhere, even if you try to stop them. So this technology was impossible to contain. And everybody knew what everybody else was building. And any knowledgeable master or even experienced seaman probably could have seen a vessel a mile away and told you where it was built based on characteristics that to us would be too subtle to notice. So there was cross-pollination. There was spying. Some of that spying went on really in the open. We have Blaise Olivier's book, a record of his visiting all these English dockyards during the period when England and France were in high rivalry, and making observations and bringing them back to France and saying, this is what they do better than we, and this is what we do better than they. So all of that was going on, and this technology really was a melting pot. It's not to say that the different countries or building traditions didn't have some distinct characteristics. As I said, they did, but there was a lot of blending.
You mentioned that everyone knew what everyone else was building when it came to maritime technology. I wonder if you could take us behind the scenes and into the process of building an 18th century British merchant vessel. How exactly did someone go about having a ship built, and how did the British go about building a merchant ship?
The most basic way to understand it is, first of all, as something built of wood, and not just any wood. The primary building material for merchant ships in the British Atlantic, and not just the British Atlantic, was white oak. So when properly seasoned, which means dried out properly before construction, so it's not wet or it doesn't have any sap in it, which will cause it to rot, white oak was an acceptable combination of strength and rot resistance and workability. And it was readily available. Having said that, it won't surprise you that timber stands in Britain itself that were good enough for shipbuilding were already under pressure in this period. You had the king's forests with the masts that you weren't allowed to take. And that helped make American ship construction a viable business really early. We know from the Balance that the shipbuilding industry in Massachusetts, the New England colony, just got going really, really early. And by 1650, it was viable, and they were actually building ships for sale to English merchants. So it was kind of a no-brainer to build ships here because, of course, there were huge stands of oak forest that hadn't been exploited the way that Europeans exploit natural resources. They could be built anywhere that there was an open space large enough and flat enough to build the size vessel you wanted to build. Had to be near enough to a body of navigable water so you could get the finished hull off the ways and into the water, so long as you could get the materials to the building site. So it couldn't be too remote, but you really could set up a shipyard in the right spot pretty quick. All the tools they used were generally hand tools. They were big hand tools, but they were hand tools. In the Netherlands and in the naval yards of London, we do find sawmills, water-powered sawmills, wind-powered sawmills, some volume building techniques. But anywhere and everywhere in the British Atlantic, if you had a shipwright and some materials, you could build vessels. You didn't need any of that just to build ordinary merchant ships. To summarize the process, so these ships are built on a skeleton. So you start with a longitudinal keel, which is the backbone. It's a long, primarily one timber. We'll simplify it. And then you have a series of curved composite frames that are built up, and they form the ribs of the skeleton, and they determine the shape of the hull. These are fastened together using both tree nails, or trunnels as it was corrupted, which are pegs of the same wood as the structure. And those are driven into very precisely drilled holes with a mallet. They also used iron bolts and they used iron nails. And the hulls then are planked. And the planking is fastened primarily by nails. And then the seams are caulked to seal. And they caulk them with stuff called oakum, which is twisted fibers. It's twisted into a thick yarn. Those are pounded into the seams with special mallets and irons. And then they're sealed with pitch, which is boiled down from pine sap. That's a gross oversimplification. These were complex, sophisticated contrivances. They had special diagonal braces called knees and other specialized reinforcements, decks around gun ports, hatches. All of it was intended to keep the hull as rigid as possible. And a lot of the skill and technique of design and construction had to do with coming up with ways of doing that, ways of making the hull rigid and keeping it from flexing and leaking. So that's no small task for something that's put together out of hundreds of pieces of wood and then thrown in the ocean where it's going to be worked in all directions by the winds and the waves. But that's the basics of it.
I suppose this is because I worked in the Charlestown Navy Yard when I worked for the National Park Service, but when I picture ships being built, my mind always creates a dry dock. And it sounds like, from your description, that dry docks weren't really a thing in the 18th century, or perhaps they were, but not for merchant vessels, and that these merchant ships would have been built on land and then somehow pushed into the water that they were building by.
Yeah, dry docks did exist, but that kind of infrastructure is going to be, you're going to find that in your Royal Navy dockyards on the Thames in London. You're going to find that where the state has money to spend on that kind of thing, because those sorts of infrastructure projects were tremendously expensive, and they still are. And funny enough, we still build vessels up to a certain size in a similar way. You can go on YouTube and waste time watching little videos of even modest size, certainly ships bigger than anything they were going to launch, that are built on the banks and then slid down the ways into a river or into a harbor. So we still do that. We build more craft like that than we do in dry docks. Dry docks, though, were very important for the maintenance and construction of very large warships, East Indiamen. But in our British Atlantic that we're talking about, we don't see really large ships like that playing an important role. We're dealing with small craft, modest-sized craft because of the nature of the British Atlantic economy. So that's important because it means that building these things could be spread out, and it didn't take an enormous amount of resources to do it.
Now, could you describe the size of one of these merchantmen or merchant ships? Because they sound modestly sized or small, depending on how you're describing it. And I wonder how a merchant ship would have compared to the much larger trading vessels that would have traded in the Pacific Ocean, in the East Indies. So how does a merchant ship compare to the size of an 18th century East Indiaman?
An East Indiaman was as large as one of the line of battleships that would have been used for major naval engagements. Wasn't as big as the absolute biggest of those, but some of them were close. As a matter of fact, under James I, the East India Company built a 1,000-ton East Indiaman called the Trades Increase, sent it to Asia, and it was wrecked. And it was such a loss that they backed off the size of it. And the reason I bring that up is because they were certainly capable of building something that big. But in the British Atlantic, a 400-ton ship would have been really large. Most of them were 300 tons or less. And tonnage is hard for people that are uninitiated in this to really wrap their brains around. So I try to use length to give some idea, with the caveat that two vessels of the same length can be vastly different in terms of their breadth, their capacity, but nevertheless, it's at least a rough idea. And so to translate it into something people can visualize, I would say most of the ordinary merchant vessels that we're talking about were somewhere between the size of the tractor part of a modern U.S. tractor trailer, which is 53 feet, to about the size of a large yacht. Not the biggest yachts on Earth, but when you see a yacht that you're like, wow, that's a big yacht, that's a rich person. 150 feet to 50 feet, somewhere in there was typical. So to us, we don't think of these things as the size of ships at all. We think of them as the size of boats. And I'm sure that, when people go to Plymouth Plantation and they look at Mayflower 2, or especially when they go to Jamestown and look at Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, they're struck by how small they are. And that has to do with the size of the population and the size of the economy that they're serving. But as we'll get into, it also has to do a lot with risk mitigation.
Turning now to the business side of things, how big of a business was shipbuilding in the 18th century? Was this a business where a whole community would participate in the town's like one big industry? Or was shipbuilding more of a modest affair, one of many industries that a town might have in its economy?
I would say the second is more accurate. It certainly didn't take, an army of people to build an ordinary merchantman. You might see 2, 3, 4 guys working on it consistently till it was done. But sometimes it would just be a shipwright and maybe his son or his labor help guy doing it. So it was definitely not, generally speaking, something that required an all-in effort to do. It was a specialty. It was a special trade. But having said that, that makes it sound small. And it was. If you were building a 60-foot schooner in a small town in New England, it didn't take that many people to do that. It didn't take that long to do that. As an industry, though, across the empire, the shipping and shipbuilding industries were huge. It was a big part of the economy. In fact, for British America, one of the real leaps forward in our understanding of the colonial British American economy that got us past where we were and into the the modern understanding of that was understanding how big the shipping and shipbuilding industries were, because they were a huge part of what got labeled invisible earnings from back when people were figuring all that out in the 70s and 80s. This was a big part of it. So it was a very important industry for the British Empire as a whole, for this whole British Atlantic world.
And who could participate in this industry? Was this an industry that was exclusively the purview of white men, or would enslaved people, free people of color, and women participate in shipbuilding too?
Certainly not restricted to white men. As far as women go, I strongly suspect that the participation of women in the craft of shipbuilding was minimal, with the important caveat that you always have to throw in for this world, as you know, that participation in it also includes the business end of it. And like other early modern businesses, women often inherited interest in the businesses of their male relatives. They sometimes took an active role in managing those businesses. When they married shipwrights, they would probably naturally become involved in the business end of that. And that encompasses a lot. It's more than just keeping the books, which they might have done. As for the actual work, however, I don't know of any direct evidence for that. And I think it's important to remember the strong acculturated divisions of labor by gender in this society, and that those would have precluded it for the most part. Because you're dealing with a physically demanding work that required both skill and strength. You're manipulating large, dangerous hand tools like axes, saws, and adzes that can easily take off your leg. So the upper body strength of the male was certainly advantageous in doing this. And of course, added to that are the restrictions placed by the society. People generally didn't want to teach basic arithmetic and mathematics to girls. And those were, if you were going to learn anything that was helpful in the shipyard, that was really what would be helpful in the shipyard. And in England, though not as much in British America, which is generally true, shipbuilding is a guild craft. It goes back to the early 15th century. If I'm recalling right, the first charter for the English Shipwrights Guild was issued by Henry VIII. And craft guilds, of course, did not admit women. It would have been, I think, one of the more difficult crafts for women to get into, even if they'd wanted to. So I think their contributions would have been as so often happened, behind the scenes, in the office, in the shop, trying to help make things happen and go smoothly rather than out there hewing timber.
My guess is that women may have also participated in shipbuilding by actually working in a complementary industry like sailmaking, for example, and other areas of ship outfitting.
Yes, it would be interesting, actually, and I have not looked into this. It would be interesting to look into sailmaking in particular and see to what extent you might find them doing that.
Now, Michael asks if shipbuilders built custom ships to suit the specific needs of ship owners. So, Philip, what options would a ship buyer have when it came to buying a merchant vessel in the 18th century? Is it like a car and there are all sorts of options that a prospective ship buyer could add?
It's a good question. To a significant extent, most ships were custom built, at least to the extent that they were built to order rather than on speculation or on spec. We still use that terminology, where you would build something on your own initiative, hoping you would find a buyer for it or buyers for it while you were building it or after construction. Shipbuilding agreements between shipwrights and owners do survive in some number, fortunately. I use them a lot in the book, so we can get a good sense of what the owner's priorities were. Capacity was as important as anything. So the earliest specification we tend to see from prospective owners is tonnage. Contracting with so-and-so to build a ship of 200 tons. Owners would then go into some detail about the sort of vessel they wanted. They had already formed opinions, most of them, about what was suitable and desirable, at least in general, based on past experience. Or if they didn't have much of that, they would base it on some advice they were getting from someone who did. A certain shipwright might specialize in certain types of vessels. Someone like David Lowell, who was a shipwright in Amesbury, Massachusetts in the late 18th century, whose journal survives that I have looked at, would not likely be retained to build a 300-ton full-rigged ship for the transatlantic trade. But he would spend his days building sloops and schooners for coastal work and for fishing. As long as the owner didn't ask the shipwright to do something he couldn't do based on his skills and resources, he would do anything the owner could pay for. With the important caveat that builders with integrity would not build a vessel they did not consider proper or seaworthy. And I've seen this. They would push back against owner requests that they thought would compromise the vessel, because that would also potentially compromise their reputations and thus their prospects for future business. It's also important, though, what owners would leave up to a shipwright's discretion. Owners like Wynne and Hawksworth, whose order I discuss in detail in the book, might have definite ideas about what they wanted their vessel to be able to do, but they largely left it up to the shipwright to determine the design details that would achieve those results. We have to remember that these vessels were built by eye, so to speak, rather than by plans. So much of the shipwright's knowledge of good design would go directly from his brain to the structure itself. Some things we would consider basic, such as rig type, if it was going to be a schooner or a brig, a sloop or a ship, are sometimes entirely missing from the agreements and presumably left up to the advice of the shipwright.
Was there a market for used ships? Because we talked earlier about how, at least initially, the British went out and captured Dutch and French sailing vessels and used those vessels in their British Atlantic trade. But now I wonder if there was a market for used ships, because it doesn't sound like there were a lot of shipbuilders building on spec. So if you're a merchant and you need something much quicker than a shipbuilder can build, was there a way to acquire a used ship that could possibly fill your needs more immediately?
The used market was certainly important. And you get that from reading the correspondence of the big shipping firms in New England. They are often looking at used vessels, or someone will write to a Brown or a Crown and Shield or a Derby and say, I have this vessel for sale. Are you interested? And then the partners will write to each other about the vessel and discuss whether or not they're interested, what they want for it in terms of money, what kind of condition it's in. So that's very important. And of course, as is still true, you could save money buying a used vessel, maybe half. On the other hand, you've got to evaluate the condition and decide, is it even worth buying this thing? And if I buy it, how much work am I have to do to make it right? So the same sorts of things really that you would expect them to have to deal with, and the same sorts of stuff that you would deal with now in a similar situation. So yes, the used market was important. You could go look at a vessel at anchor in harbor or tied up to a wharf that was for sale. These would be advertised for sale in the newspapers. So you might know in Boston that there was a ship for sale in Philadelphia that you might be interested in. You might even know that there was one for sale in Liverpool that you might be interested in. So yes, that was certainly a common way to get something.
Since there was a used market in ships, Barney wonders what the life expectancy of an 18th century merchant ship would have been. So, just how long were these ships expected to last and be in service? And what kinds of problems or maintenance might have shortened or lengthened the lifespan of a merchant ship?
Longevity is a tricky one, and work still remains to be done on it. It varied perhaps dramatically, depending primarily, I would say, on three things. First was how well the vessel was built in the first place. Did they use seasoned timber? Was it built on the cheap, or was it really built right? Second would be where the vessel was used. And third would be how well the vessel was maintained. The British shipping lobby always maintained that American-built vessels were inferior to British-built ships in terms of longevity. There's some evidence to support the contention, but they were obviously biased, and the scholarship, I think, yields mixed results. The worst enemy to a wooden ship was the mollusk, whose Latin name is Teredo nivalis, commonly called the shipworm, though it wasn't a worm. And this thing could bore through the timbers of an oak ship efficiently enough that a vessel left unprotected in warm waters, anywhere, say from Virginia at the right time of year south to the Caribbean, could be ruined in a season. So all ocean-going ships had some sort of bottom coating, usually a mixture in this period called white stuff, and that was made of horsehair felt, tallow, and sulfur, and smeared on the hull to inhibit not just shipworm invasion, but also the growth of seaweed and algae that could slow the ship down by more than half if it was left unchecked, especially in warm water. So keeping the bottom clean by scraping and burning the growth off the bottom was very important. The tobacco ships in the Chesapeake, for example, would get upriver before worm season as fast as they could because that mollusk can't live in fresh water. So it's not surprising that ships that spent a lot of time in the Caribbean tended to have shorter working lives than ships primarily used in colder water. A ship that was driven hard and survived lots of bad weather would wear out more quickly than one that had an easier working life. In general, I would say, based on what I've seen so far, that the life expectancy varied from perhaps 5 to 20 years, although there were certainly ships still in service that were older than that. Some 18th century merchant ships survived long enough to be photographed in the mid-19th century. Those are fascinating photographs to see, given how old those things were at the time. So it's all over the place. And you could wear a ship out really, really fast if you didn't build it right, take care of it. But on the other hand, they could last a few decades.
One thing that I think our conversation has really danced around to this point is that shipowning and shipbuilding sound like very expensive endeavors. And after we take a quick moment for our episode sponsor, I'd like for us to talk more about the costs associated with merchant ships and who in the 18th century had the financial ability and capacity to be a shipowner, given all the costs involved. This episode is brought to you by the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of award-winning books since 1943. In his celebrated account of the origins of American unity, John Adams described July 1776 as the moment when 13 clocks struck at the same time. But once these clocks struck, how did the American colonies overcome long odds to create a durable union capable of declaring and keeping independence from Great Britain? In a powerful new history of the 15 tense months that culminated in the Declaration of Independence, historian Robert Parkinson provides a troubling answer: racial fear. In his new book, 13 Clocks, Parkinson traces the circulation of information in the colonial news systems that linked patriot leaders with average colonists. Parkinson reveals how participants in these news systems constructed a compelling drama featuring virtuous men who suddenly found themselves threatened by ruthless Indians and defiant slaves, all acting on behalf of the king. 13 Clocks was published by the Omohundro Institute and their publishing partner, the University of North Carolina Press. And 13 Clocks is available now in paperback for the low price of $20. If you want to read what one scholar calls the most original work on 1776 in a generation, then check out 13 Clocks by Robert Parkinson, available now in paperback for $20. You can purchase your copy of 13 Clocks by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/clocks. That's benfranklinsworld.com/clocks. Philip, would you tell us more about the costs associated with merchant ships and who in the 18th century had the financial ability to be a shipowner, given that there are costs involved in shipbuilding, operation, and maintenance?
Well, you're absolutely right that they were quite expensive. Ships have always been seriously expensive to build and operate, and they still are. When you add in the significant risks that you associate with them, then they get even more expensive. The costs and the risks meant most ships were commissioned and owned by multiple owners. A single ship, in fact, could have up to 16 owners legally in the British Empire at this time. Usually one or two managing owners would handle the actual running of the ship, while the other owners would receive dividends from the profits, if of course there were any. So for example, in 1742, Daniel Flexney paid £1,255, 17 shillings and 5 pence for the building, fitting out, and sundry expenses associated with the modest-sized merchant ship Mary, which was built for him at Philadelphia by that city's most prominent builder at that time, Charles West. To give some idea of how much money that was, in 1768, more than 20 years later, an able seaman's monthly wage in the Royal Navy was £1, 2 shillings and 6 pence. And the Navy's wages were good relative to what else was available for a laboring man. So at that rate, that able seaman would have to work more than a century and save every penny of his wages to buy that ship. So Mr. Flexney was obviously a merchant of some means. As an aside, though, because this is, after all, Ben Franklin's world, I should note that among those sundry expenses paid out by Mr. Flexney's Philadelphia agent was a bill for £12, 19 shillings and 0 pence for advertising for 3 deserters in the Gazette, plus £4 each for advances paid to them, as mentioned in the ad, presented by none other than, you guessed it, Benjamin Franklin.
We do always love a good Benjamin Franklin connection, so thank you for sharing that anecdote. Now, it sounds like one way that ship owners handle the costs that were involved in ship owning and ship maintenance was to partner with other merchants and to co-own a ship. So they spread out the costs through multi-person ownership. But what were the potential risks that ship owners really had to be aware of? And what were the potential rewards to help encourage a potential ship owner to make the investment in owning a ship?
Well, I think this is the key question to get at a core understanding of this technology. I found that merchant ship technology in this period is probably best understood as a technology of risk mitigation. Those risks were financial and physical, and you really can't separate the two. If you lose the ship, you lose both money and people's lives. And unless you could adequately mitigate the risks, then the rewards you were seeking would likely remain elusive. The first important risk mitigation to mention is the most big picture example, and that is that as the British Atlantic economy expanded, so the demand for shipping grew along with that, the sizes of individual ships only increased modestly, but the size of the overall fleet grew dramatically. So the most fundamental risk mitigation that we see is to keep ship size modest and build more of them. So this ties in with the fractional ownership that I already mentioned. It's about spreading risk and minimizing disaster when vessels are lost or captured. The complete set of risks that any individual merchant ship faced would strike us now as pretty much outrageous. But if you wanted to participate, then those were the risks that you accepted. So if you built or bought the vessel on credit, then you went into it in debt. You had to find a competent, trustworthy master and enough capable crew to run the thing safely and effectively. And there was a perennial shortage of skilled maritime labor in the British Atlantic. That kept wages high, and that gave owners then in turn strong incentives to keep crew sizes as small as possible. You had to trust the master not only to run the ship and supervise the crew, but to conduct the ship's business in destination ports. If he turned out to be a bad businessman, he could cost you whatever profits you were hoping for on that voyage. There's a good example of this in the book, in the case of the hapless Captain George Blunt. You had to trust him to be a good manager, as sailors did not hesitate to desert a situation they found not to their liking, even if it meant forfeiting their wages. And that could leave the ship dangerously undermanned or even stranded in port. And then there's the markets, which pose their own set of unavoidable risks. Communication in this world was sophisticated, but it was only as fast as the fastest ship. Merchants devoured every scrap of business news they could get their hands on, and the business press thrived. We know that from John McCusker. Nevertheless, you could send your vessel down to Barbados or over to London with the latest information on availability of goods and prices for them, only for your master to find when he got there that the market was already glutted and prices were depressed, or that all the goods were already taken, or that the prices on offer for the cargo he bought were far lower than he'd been led to believe. As for potential damage or loss, the danger was everywhere. Storms that could generate waves taller than the ship were rocks, reefs, shoals near the coast, fire, lightning, enemy cruisers. Remember that there was far more war than peace in this period, and during wartime, merchant ships were subject to capture by both enemy naval vessels and privateers. In crowded ports, they were routinely damaged by other ships crashing into them during storms or even during a changing tide if their anchors dragged. So in terms of mitigating these risks in general, your best bet was a capable crew, a sound vessel, constant, careful maintenance, and avoiding the worst weather, such as, for example, staying out of the Caribbean during hurricane season, But trade went on all year long, and vessels did brave the winters of the North Atlantic, and they did brave Caribbean hurricanes in September, chasing profits.
Those are a lot of risks. And when I think about risks today, risks to your life, risks to your home during hurricane season, I think about insurance. Was there any way to invest in an insurance plan in the 18th century to help protect your ship from the dangers of capture or being lost and damaged at sea that, ship owners could also use to mitigate the risks involved in ship owning?
Yes, insurance certainly existed. It actually became an important maritime industry in the 18th century British Atlantic. There's been some good recent scholarship on that. As you guess, rates vary drastically depending on the risks the underwriters thought they were taking on. In peacetime, avoiding areas where the vessel was likely to run into dangerous weather, insurance could be just a few percentage points of the value of the cargo and vessel. On the other hand, let's say during wartime and on routes where the vessel was likely to be captured, it could be prohibitive or even unavailable. The development of the insurance industry went hand in hand with the Royal Navy's increasing ability to protect British Atlantic commerce in all parts of the Atlantic and the Caribbean basins. The convoy system was far more effective later in this period than earlier, and insurance underwriters demanded that owners use convoys during wartime, on pain of the denial of any claims for loss or capture. So that's a real important part of the development of risk mitigation in ways that we would readily understand. But convoys weren't perfect. They were only as fast as the fastest vessel in the convoy. So some owners and masters chose to risk it and sail solo. If you did that and your vessel was sighted by a predator, then your best bet was a combination of subterfuge and escape. Flying false colors was ubiquitous in those situations, but the thing is, masters and crew knew that the predator was probably doing the same thing, and the predator knew that you were doing it. Piling on sail, running away was by far the best option. But if you were captured, and we know this from owners' correspondence with their masters, masters would try to ransom their vessels and cargoes, and this usually worked. The vessel was allowed to go on its way with perhaps a couple of hostages taken out of the crew in exchange for the payment of a hefty ransom. Members of Parliament began to complain that owners were making little attempt to evade enemy predators since they carried insurance policies that covered these ransoms. So this was something they were trying to sort out.
Another way to mitigate the risk of ship owning and transatlantic shipping was to hire a capable crew. So what kind of crew would a ship owner need to hire to operate and protect their ship? Like, what kind of skill sets was he looking for in crew members? And what would you as a ship owner need to pay your crew in order to hire a reliable and capable crew to protect and operate your vessel?
The crew was an ongoing major expense, but it was unavoidable and essential. Not only were their wages high, but they had to be fed and watered, and their food and water took up a lot of space that could otherwise be used to carry cargo for profit. On the other hand, the crew's skills and their muscles were really an integral part of the ship as a mechanical contraption, if you will. Working a sailing vessel was complicated business and required a highly advanced set of skills and knowledge to do properly. At the same time, it was physically demanding, frequently exhausting, and thus it tended to be a young man's work. Despite the legend of the old salt that has been passed down to all of us, in reality, most sailors were in their late teens, 20s, and 30s. Very few were ever going to be mates or masters, as that required numeracy and literacy, and that was rare in the laboring classes. Most of those sailors would eventually go ashore and into other trades, frequently trades closely related to maritime enterprise. In British America, as Daniel Vickers taught us, it was common for young men to work on the farm seasonally and at sea during the rest of the year, but not when they were older. The other characteristic of British Atlantic crews that would have struck us as observers is their polyglot nature, how diverse they were. Despite the laws requiring that the majority of crews be British subjects were a diverse lot by the 18th century, and a sizable minority of those crews would have been from all over the world by that point. The deck of a merchant ship was also one of the few places where a black man could perhaps find not just good employment, but the chance for advancement. We know that in more remote parts of the Atlantic Empire, such as, for example, coastal North Carolina, it was not unheard of for a black master to own partly or fully the sloop or schooner that he commanded in coastal trade. Slave owners in Bermuda routinely sent their enslaved young men to sea, and while those sailors were technically still enslaved, they lived lives of far greater freedom and autonomy than most of their land-bound counterparts, at least as long as they managed to remain at sea.
Now, something that may surprise you when you read Philip's book, The Merchant Ship in the British Atlantic, is that Many 18th century sailors did have physically demanding skill sets, but one of the skill sets that they didn't have was the ability to swim. Philip, how is the ability to swim not an essential skill for being a sailor?
Well, that question, I think, can be deceiving in that it may sound more marginal than it is. It actually gets at something really important. This question gets at the risk tolerance and the labor culture of these sailors. And that is, I think, essential to understanding all of this. First of all, though, it is worth mentioning that swimming was just not generally considered a wholesome activity in this society. It was not a sport or a recreation. It would have been associated with getting cold and wet and thus vulnerable to both drowning and to illness. But beyond that, and more to our point, we have a wonderful quote from Benjamin Franklin. Our seafaring people are brave despite danger and reject such precautions of safety, being cowards only in one sense, that of fearing to be thought afraid. And here Franklin's not talking specifically of swimming, but the general observation applies. You would have found close to none of the modern safety precautions we take for granted on commercial vessels, even the smallest, most modest ones, even precautions that would have been technologically feasible for them. Sailors at the time in this world accepted the risks of the sea, and they gained cultural capital within their subculture by facing the dangers of their trade with a certain degree of insouciance.
You mentioned that a lot of sailors wouldn't have had the numeracy or literacy needed to become a ship's captain or ship's officer. But it does seem like if you were a captain or an officer, you needed to have these skills in order to navigate the ocean. Could you tell us what was involved in navigating one of these merchant ships in an era that long predates the invention of GPS and smartphones that literally tell you where to go and how to get there?
The ability to navigate, as you touched on, was the most important dividing line between an experienced, able seaman and a mate or a master. Because it required numeracy and literacy, and these were skills that were rare among working people in this period. We didn't have universal education, even at a basic level. So it was typical here to find a social divide between even the most experienced and skilled sailor and the mate and master of a vessel, because those were the people who would have had access to at least a basic education. And in this world, that was even more of a rigid hierarchy than it is in ours. And in ours, of course, as we know, it hasn't disappeared by any means. So there was a real ceiling that effectively limited professional mobility on deck. Of course, there were exceptions. It isn't that there are no examples of people who started out as ordinary seamen or able seamen and eventually became mates or masters, but it was not the rule. It was the exception. In our own time, we call navigating inside of land and landmarks piloting, and navigating farther offshore without such aids, we call that navigation. But even piloting required skills that able seamen didn't generally possess. And the most basic of those were taking and recording bearings on objects with a compass or with a sextant or octant, reading a chart, keeping a log of the time, the estimated positions, the bearings to known points, weather conditions, and remarks on sail changes, what was going on aboard the vessel. Those were basic requirements. Out of sight of land, the vessel's position was kept primarily by combining information from two different sources. The first of those was by deduced, or for short, dead reckoning. And dead reckoning was an estimated position based on the distance traveled and in what direction from the last known point. So the reckoning was based on taking speed measurements with a chip log off the stern and tracking the ship's heading with the steering compass. It was subject to errors from the wind, the current, compass deviation, and inaccuracies inherent in the chip log. And those errors, of course, would grow in magnitude the longer the ship sailed from that last known point. The second source was the noon sun sight, which was taken with a device, and that depends on what period we're in. In the 17th century, that would have been a cross staff or a back staff, or maybe an astrolabe. But in the 18th century, it would have been an octant and later a sextant. And these devices measured the angle of the sun's position at noon to the horizon. The navigator can then perform a series of calculations on that angle that would determine his latitude, which is how far north or south of the equator he was. The noon sun sight then would be used to correct the dead reckoning. And that's just how it was done, day after day, month after month, year after year. The determination of longitude was out of reach of most navigators until the early 19th century, though some highly skilled and mathematically talented navigators of the late 18th century could use a complex technique that they called lunar distances to derive longitude. In general, though, it didn't become common to be able to determine longitude until the marine chronometer became practical and reasonably affordable. And it is true that Harrison's chronometer, these became practicable at the end of the 18th century, but they were still experimental. They were still expensive. These were basically in the hands of the Navy. What I'm getting at is that when they became, dispersed, affordable, made in enough numbers to be distributed, around the merchant fleet, then you would have more and more people being able to calculate longitude. But in our period, it really just wasn't a basic part of navigation.
We've talked a lot about ships, and we now have a good idea of what ships were like in the 18th century, the different purposes they served, how they were built and by whom they were built by, who operated and maintained them, and different aspects of sailing life. So now I really think we need to talk about the other aspect of shipping, which are the things ships carried, their cargoes. So Philip, would you tell us about the cargoes ship owners would transport across the Atlantic Ocean?
Yes, of course, cargoes are as important as anything because, after all, they're the whole reason that the ships are sailing in the first place. Different types of vessels of different sizes were all over the Atlantic world, so they were carrying just about anything and everything from someplace to someplace else. I like to point out that water transport was even more important in this world than it is in ours, and we still move about 90% of our goods by water. They move closer to 100% of theirs. They had very little land infrastructure for transport. Land travel tended to be, as I mentioned, slow, expensive, potentially dangerous, depending on who you might expect to meet on the road, if there was a road. And as for volume, even now, nothing can compete with a big ship. That was just as true then. But they use watercraft more comprehensively than we do. So goods might come into a major port on a ship and then get split up, and some of them might then travel on a sloop or a schooner up and down the coast or up a river or to the West Indies. And then they might be offloaded into small sailing boats or even canoes, where they could be taken up creeks along the shores of small bays. So waterways were highways, not walls, depending on whether they were big or small. So in British America, ships came into Boston or Philadelphia or Charleston or the Chesapeake with manufactured goods from Britain and passengers. Many of those passengers were indentured servants, but some were traveling on business or to join families that were already here. And those ships would leave usually a few to several months later with the produce of America. So tobacco, rice, sugar products, wheat, and with passengers headed for Britain or Europe. Thanks to the commercial treaty with Portugal, ships from Lisbon brought wine and fruit and took back wheat and fish. And there was a constant stream of sloops and schooners that was bringing molasses and sugar and rum from the West Indies to the eastern seaboard. So roughly speaking, you had transatlantic traffic using larger vessels and coastal and island traffic using smaller vessels. And then, of course, you had the African slave trade, which was enormous. Thanks to the Atlantic Slave Trade Database, we now know that at least 12 million African prisoners were transported, most of them in the 18th century. So when you think about the fact that each ship could hold somewhere between a handful of prisoners and perhaps 200 for the larger slavers, you realize the enormity of this traffic in terms of the number of ships making the number of voyages. Most of these ships went to the West Indies plantations, but plenty of them came into Charleston and the Chesapeake. All perishable cargoes presented challenges, but nothing is more perishable than living creatures. The death toll on the Middle Passage was horrendous, but it was also grim on vessels carrying poor immigrants, many of whom weren't, of course, in the best health when they started the journey. As for other cargoes, Chesapeake tobacco merchants got better over time at packing their product so that it would stay dry and so they could maximize the amount they could fit into a hogshead, which is a standard sized large barrel. Fresh wine, the wine we generally drink, was enormously difficult to ship. Everything that contributes to its deterioration, from motion to heat to damp, tended to ruin it by the time it could reach its destination. So, as we learned from David Hancock, Portuguese wine merchants came up with fortified wine mixed with brandy, and that preserved the wine. It's very different from, say, a French Bordeaux, but that was illegal to import into British America anyway, and Americans developed an insatiable appetite for what they learned to call Madeira after the Portuguese islands that produced it.
We've definitely covered a lot of ground today and learned a lot about how 18th century merchant ships facilitated British Atlantic trade. So Philip, zooming out here, why do you think it's important for us to look at early American history and the history of the British Atlantic world through the histories of 18th century British merchant ships? What should our takeaway be?
I think because it was quite simply a maritime world. The British Atlantic and British America consisted of ocean basins, the communities at the edges of the basins, and the boats and ships that were traversing those basins and connecting those communities. So when we say the Atlantic world, referring to this period, we're talking about a new world that connected Europe, Africa, the Atlantic islands, and the Americas in ways that they had never been connected before. And that was done by using merchant ships, for better or for worse. I also encourage people to use the merchant ship of the period as an entree into technological history. We have such a distorted impression of technological history in our day, with our obsession with innovation over continuity, with our blindness to how much we rely on old technologies in our everyday lives, and the fact that we're now a few generations into a world where technology is driven by mass production and mass marketing. So we need to understand how people developed and built and used technology before all that, and still do in much of the world. Studying this technology is a good antidote to that Western tendency toward technological determinism, of which the old adage, form follows function, is the most notorious example. That strips away all of the cultural embeddedness of technology, and thus so much of what it has to teach us about the people who made and used it. That's what we can learn when we think about, for example, the risk tolerance, the labor demands that we've been talking about.
And with that, we should jump into the time warp. So this is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. Philip, in your opinion, how might the history of the Atlantic world and the British American colonies have been different if the 18th century merchant ship had never been invented?
Well, this is a particularly tough counterfactual for me to wrap my head around, but I think it might be helpful to think of vessels that did successfully traverse the Atlantic before the early modern merchant ship. So we know, for example, that the Vikings got as far as Newfoundland, and perhaps from there as far south as Maine, at least for a little bit, with their vessels. On the other hand, as far as we now know, Mediterranean craft never came out into the Atlantic, turned south, and rode the trade winds down into the Caribbean. So I think perhaps the two advantages that this counterfactual highlights for us about the early modern Atlantic merchant ship. First, its versatility. It could go the northern route, it could go the southern trade winds route, and it could work its way back up the eastern seaboard from the Caribbean and go back to the British Isles on the prevailing westerlies that we find up around New England and what's now Atlantic Canada. Related to that is its ability to sustain settlements once they were established. So the versatility of the merchant ship, as well as its capacity, made that possible. Remember the lost colony of North Carolina established on Roanoke Island in 1587 that was gone when the resupply ships got back? Because they had been unexpectedly delayed. And archaeologists actually just confirmed within the past few months that that colony amalgamated itself with a friendly indigenous group by necessity. So that highlights for us how important merchant ships were to sustain these colonies. They had to be able to go back and forth on a pretty regular basis. The Massachusetts Bay and Jamestown colonies were dependent on Atlantic shipping from the get-go. I think, though, to avoid the technological determinism trap that I mentioned earlier, though, it's important to remember that under different circumstances, the early modern Atlantic merchant ship might have looked different and had somewhat different characteristics than it actually did. But without absolute central control, as in, let's say, Imperial China, where some central authority can just say, right, that's enough of that, no more ocean voyaging, Europeans were going to find some way to traverse the oceans, not just the Atlantic, but the Indian and ultimately the Pacific, because their social and economic and political situations compelled them to, and their culture encouraged them to.
So, Philip, are you working on a new maritime-related research and writing project?
I am in the late stages of research for a book quite different from this one, in that it's a microhistory, where instead of taking a broad look at a broad subject, I focus in on the career of a single vessel over a 4-year period. In this case, it's a small Boston schooner taken into the Royal Navy in 1768 and used as a customs interceptor along the eastern seaboard of British America from then until 1772. And this took place as London's attempts to tighten up on revenue collection and control of the British American maritime economy got a lot more serious with the passage of the Townshend Acts. And because this little vessel was taken into the Navy, we have almost outrageously good records on her, which is rare for an ordinary merchant type. And the story of this vessel at that time just sits right in the middle of British American technological and commercial development, the direction of the British Empire after the 7 Years' War, and the conflicts between the two, both between America and Britain and within America and Britain. And this story will give you literally a deck level view of all that as it was happening.
It also sounds like this story has a bit of irony to it, since it was a Boston vessel and Bostonians were really known for evading all sorts of customs duties.
Oh, yes. There are so many wonderful ironies in this that I very much look forward to writing them all down.
What is the best place for us to get in contact with you if we have more questions about maritime history and 18th century merchant ships?
That would definitely be my website, which is www.philipfrankreid.com. And that's Philip with 2 L's and Reid, R-E-I-D. And my email is available on the website.
Philip Reid, thank you for taking us inside and behind the scenes of 18th century British merchant ships and their role in the British Atlantic world.
You're welcome, Liz. I was very happy to do it.
The 18th century merchant ship served as the glue that kept the British Atlantic world connected and together. Merchants used merchant ships to send goods, people, and information from Great Britain to its North American and Caribbean colonies, and vice versa. And this trade in goods, people, and information kept many Britons feeling as connected as possible to Great Britain and to its colonial cultures and imperial news. Now, as Philip noted, maintaining this transatlantic connection proved to be difficult, expensive, and risky work. To build a ship required a plentiful supply of white oak, oakum, and knowledgeable shipbuilders. Each ship was constructed by hand, and once on the water, each ship had to be maintained and operated by a knowledgeable crew. To hire shipbuilders, purchase supplies, and secure the work of a knowledgeable crew required a significant financial investment. So as Philip related, mitigating the financial risks of shipowning proved to be a fundamental and important part of doing transatlantic business. Wind, waves, and sea life constantly worked at ship hulls. Hurricanes, nor'easters, and other storms might badly damage a ship or send a ship plus its crew and cargo to the ocean floor. And then there were pirates and wars. Ship owners looked to spread out these costs of transatlantic shipping. They did this by taking out insurance plans, partnering with other merchants, and by making sure they had experienced crews and well-maintained ships. The risks of transatlantic trade and connection were always large, but these were the costs of seeking big profits and for keeping the British Atlantic world connected as an empire. Look for more information about Philip, his book, The Merchant Ship in the British Atlantic, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/309. If you're interested in the American Revolution, don't forget to check out Robert Parkinson's new book, 13 Clocks. You can find more information about this book and purchase a copy for yourself at benfranklinsworld.com/clocks. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team. Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Ben Franklin's World is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what other early American technologies would you like to investigate? Let me know. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.